MLS suspended its 25th anniversary on March the 12th due to the coronavirus pandemic. It was confirmed this past Wednesday that play will resume with a tournament in Orlando at yet to be determined dates. But that conclusion did not come easily, perhaps with a long-lasting price. Over the weekend, Major League Soccer and its owners had alerted the MLS Players Association that if they failed to agree on what was the latest proposal from the owners, which was an adjustment to a previously agreed upon CBA because of the COVID-19, that they would have to be locked out. And that caused a lot of disdain. But late Tuesday into early Wednesday, MLS averted what would likely have been a disaster for the league, the kind of thing that might take years to recover from, and an adjusted CBA was ratified. So I'm very happy to welcome one of the players from the executive committee for the MLSPA. And I imagine he hasn't slept much in the past couple of weeks. Hopefully the last two nights were more peaceful for him. Nashville SC defender, the former New York City, Minnesota United, Colorado, where he was the team's defender of the year in 2017, and Montreal, Eric Miller. Eric, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me on the show. Thanks for remembering those teams. It's a lot of stuff to keep track of, so I appreciate it.
There is. I mean, you just keep there's some very nice cities in there, though, so you've really had some great experiences.
I'm getting a wonderful tour of all of North America. It's good so far.
All right. Well, Nashville had 2 games in their expansion season. You started and played the full matches in both those, and then boom, the door was slammed on the season due to COVID-19. Let's start at the kind of the end of this, or the last few days before this thing was ratified on whatever it was, Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. So it's the thing that really stands out, and I want to spend a little time on this and then get into some of the details, though, is the potential damage that's been done with the relationship between the owners and the players, or the league and the players. And after what was considered, I think, because I think we've talked about it, I know I've talked to Brad Stuver about it, is that the initial agreement to this CBA, which was towards the end of 2019, was deemed like a very positive experience at the end, and where it seemed like maybe the owners in the league and the players were more united than ever. We know the players were, because there was we heard that a lot too. But how much of what's your initial take on the damage done? And before you do, let me just read the tweet. Now, this got retweeted a lot. I'm sure you know that. Your tweet: although the process and tactics used by MLS left a mark, I'm incredibly proud of our player pool. Players showed commitment and strength throughout this entire process. So, you didn't have to read between the lines to know that it was a bit contentious there.
Yeah, I think for me, there's 2 important parts to think about even before you talk about the last couple of days. I think the first is that anytime you're collectively bargaining, I think it's going to get heated. Both sides are doing their utmost to get the best deal possible. And I think a lot of times that becomes heated, that becomes very combative. But I think at the end of the day, we knew that going into it. We knew that going into this last offseason trying to negotiate a CBA. And I think the second part of it is that the players realize that the league is going to struggle financially to some degree this year. I think we don't want to minimize their losses. We totally understand that playing, either missing games or playing games without fans, causes real financial harm to the league. So I think we had a full understanding of that going into things. We knew amidst the backdrop of everything that was going on that things were going to be contentious, but I don't think we saw it being as contentious as it was. I think as a player pool, we made salary cut concessions. We moved the CBA back a year. We really felt like we were doing our part. We were committed to go to Orlando for a long period of time, guys away from their families, playing in not ideal circumstances. And for the league to just continually try to squeeze concessions from us at basically every turn, I think it just became a lot for players to deal with. And I think our player pool really showed their strength and their resolve. In my 7 years in the league, I've never seen it explicitly written out in an email that the league was planning to lock us out at a certain date and at a certain time. And I think that's always the leverage that both sides have. It doesn't normally become that explicit, but the fact that it was at this date, at this time, if you don't agree to this deal, we are going to lock you out. I think that was the final straw for a lot of guys. And I think to try to imagine taking health insurance and pay away from players while there's a global pandemic going on is tone deaf. And I think for a lot of our player pool, we just couldn't believe that, because we had made so many concessions and really been negotiating good faith, that the league was still trying to just continue to use the situation that we're all in to try to make gains for their side of things.
You know, I had the boys from the Athletic on a couple of weeks back, Paul Tenorio and Sam Stageskull, who I know you've spoken to since this CBA was ratified and the agreement to go to Orlando. But I brought up the lockout at that time, and they were like, so, you know, this is no way that'll happen. There'll just be too much damage. And they said exactly what you said, is that imagine taking away health insurance in particular during the pandemic. And one unnamed source that they quoted said, "I hope these wounds eventually heal. That certainly won't be anytime soon." It just sounds regrettable.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of damage done to the relationship. Like you mentioned earlier in this chat, I think we came out of that CBA in February probably in the best place that the relationship had ever been. I think we really thought and felt like it was going to be a partnership, and that the league wanted to work with the players and the players wanted to work with the league, and we really wanted to make this league grow. And I think for MLS to ever reach its true potential, you need to have a partnership between the players and the league, because if you don't have it, it's not going to be an attractive place for players to play. Players that are playing here are going to want to leave. And I just think the actions of the league over the last week and a half are just, like you said, I think regrettable is a great word. I think we talk about it a lot, but in times of crisis, when things are going really poorly, there's a lot of companies that either took care of their employees during this pandemic or did not take care of their employees. I think we found out during a pandemic without a CBA ratified how the MLS was going to treat our player pool. And they tried to use the pandemic and all these things to leverage a better deal for themselves. And like I said, we totally understand that they're undertaking financial losses this year, but we felt like we did our part. And the fact that they continually tried to squeeze and bully us at basically every turn was something that I think they'll look back on and regret doing.
So it seemed the sticking point was, and you could confirm that after I read through this, the force majeure clause, which it sounds like a beautiful French phrase, but anything but beautiful for the players, as it turned out. But I went to this law website to look it up, because when I first saw it, I was like, I just had no idea what it was. So here's the law dictionary definition of force majeure, a common clause in contracts that essentially frees both parties from liability or obligation when an extraordinary event or circumstances beyond the control of the parties, such as this pandemic, prevents one or both parties from fulfilling their obligations under the contract. So when I hear that language, it sounds fair that either side maybe has some leverage there. So what was the difficulty with the players accepting that?
Yeah, so from our player pool side of things, look, we didn't have a force majeure in it. That was an oversight from MLS beforehand. Every other player association and their CBA, I believe, in North America has a force majeure. It's relatively commonplace in these large contracts that are made, even not in sports. In any business, force majeures are pretty common. So we didn't have one in there. And obviously now it would be essentially malpractice for any lawyer to not include a force majeure in a collective bargaining agreement. So we, as a player pool, kind of the entire time realized, like, hey, this is the thing that is probably going to be a non-starter for the league if we don't include it. So we felt like we put in a really fair force majeure. I still feel like it's very fair what we did. If there's something catastrophically bad that happens, they can enact a force majeure. But the real sticking point was that the league was trying to quantify things and talk about stadium capacity, and it was basically nonsensical what they were trying to do. And they were basically trying to just get us to basically take their language on when it didn't really make any sense, and it didn't even really become a force majeure at that point. They were talking about stadium reductions and not having stadium capacity, and the numbers originally were 90%, and then it was 75% of the stadium capacity. So from our player pool, there's a lot of clubs in the league that don't have their stadiums 75% full, and so we didn't want to be in a vulnerable position of they could enact a force majeure over people not having fans in their stadium. So from our side of things, it just didn't really make any sense, and I think that's why it was such a difficult issue, because what they were trying to do was basically illogical. We agreed that a force majeure was necessary. We had one included. Ours was modeled similarly to other players associations, and that felt fair to us. And again, the league continually tried to squeeze us and make it more advantageous for their position. I think that was probably, towards the end of things, one of the biggest issues with our player pool and thinking about how our league was handling the situation.
Okay, so is that specific in the clause that they directed towards stadium attendance? What would trigger it now? So what in your language would trigger it for either side?
So I am not a labor lawyer. Let's keep that in mind. But my understanding
is you're sounding very lawyerly like there, Eric. So go ahead.
So there, I believe, is three parts of it. There's a part where it's basically if the players or the league can't fulfill their obligations. So if for some reason you can't play in stadiums, if you can't travel, if you can't do any of these things, the league can enact a force majeure. And that is, in my estimation, very fair. Players understand that, look, if we can't play soccer games, something should happen. From the league's perspective, if they can't host games and make revenue, then something should be able to happen, and they should be able to enact a force majeure. So I think ours is very fair now. If this coronavirus problem doesn't get solved by next season, we could be right back kind of in the same position negotiating this offseason, because they could theoretically enact a force majeure, and we would be back at the table kind of negotiating all over again.
Yeah, that's where the connection to the attendance part of that clause would be could be perilous, because you don't even know if people are going to be allowed into the stadium next year.
Yeah, that is obviously a part of it, and their numbers that they were selecting were just kind of outrageous, to be honest. It was first 90%, then 75% capacity, and if you're going to have a global pandemic, you can't have that many people in the stadium regardless. So I just think our language is fair. It makes sense, and I think that was kind of where our player pool was at, where we made this big concession to include a force majeure. We modeled it after other force majeures that exist for player associations. And then the league was just trying to gain more, which was kind of their style the entire negotiation, but kind of towards the end, the force majeure stuff kind of just became the final straw, where players were basically saying, this is all we can do, and if you need more, then I guess you need to lock this out.
So do the players agree with the commissioner, Don Garber, and the owners that in terms of revenue, it is driven primarily by attendance at the games, which certainly could be one reason that they were kind of directing it that way?
Yeah, look, I think we as players understand that if you can't play and host games with fans, you're going to make less money. That's inevitable. And I think players, no matter how much schooling or education you have, it's easy to understand that if there's no people in stadiums, then the league is going to have significantly less revenue. So I think we don't want to minimize that from the league's perspective at all. We totally understand this is a difficult year for everybody, and professional sports are probably the second hardest hit industry aside from restaurants and bars. So I think we don't want to minimize their losses, but we also realize that we took part in sharing in those losses this year with a pay cut, with moving the CBA back. And we felt like we really did our part. So that's why it became very frustrating for our player pool towards the end, when they just continually tried to leverage the global pandemic into making more money, basically.
Was the initial pay cut in their proposal truly 50%? And if that's the case, is that maybe where the differing feelings began?
Yeah, so their initial pay cut proposal was 50% of the entire year. Considering that proposal was made not at the beginning of the year, it would have ended up looking something like a 75% pay cut for our entire player pool for the rest of the season. So, I mean, it was just tone deaf, honestly. We'd already played 3 months fully doing our jobs, going to preseason. staying fit, playing in the first couple games, and then to ask for guys to take a 75% pay cut for the rest of the season when nobody at the league office had taken that high of a number was just outrageous. And I think that was really when guys initially became enraged. And I think, honestly, it was maybe a good thing for our player pool because it got everybody's ears perked up and everybody was then involved and everyone was thinking about their personal situation, how this was all going to go. And it was the most involved I've ever seen every player in our player pool. And I think that really benefited us in the end because every guy understood the issues, understood what was going on. And that normally is the case, but when you're talking about people's paychecks, there's a different level of care and focus from guys for sure.
We're with Eric Miller. He's part of the 7-member executive committee of the Major League Soccer Players Association, representing the over 800 players in the league with a new adjusted CBA ratified. One of the things I was really curious about, and it seemed like the players were satisfied with this, but you tell me this, in the midst of the original agreement with the new television deal emerging in 2023, the players for the first time ever were going to share revenue from the media. So you came up with a concession there. So do you feel like your membership is satisfied with that?
Yeah, I think for a lot of our player pool, getting incremental media revenue, so IMR, was a huge, huge thing for us this last offseason. I think that was, like I said before, when our relationship felt like it was going well between the league and the Players Association was a huge step. You know, we really became partners. If the league did well, players were going to receive that in a quantifiable amount. And if there was a big TV deal, that would come straight back into players' pockets. And I think that was a huge step forward for our Players Association. I think that's obviously a lot of other leagues are kind of shaped in that way where their salary caps are based on revenue. So I think it kind of made sense to start heading in that direction. And I think for our player pool, it was very, very important for us to keep 2023 as the first year it started. MLS was pretty adamant that that was not going to be acceptable because everything was moving back. We ended up kind of winning that battle. We now get IMR in 2023, but at a reduced amount. So I think it makes sense for both sides. The CBA is being pushed back, but we still, because the TV deal won't get pushed back, get to share in some of their increased TV revenue in 2023.
Yeah, it's part of negotiation. And the commissioner who spoke on Wednesday for nearly an hour on a media call talked about how the labor negotiations are contentious at times, just like you had referred to earlier.
You know, obviously the last couple of months have been emotional and they've been difficult. As I mentioned, labor negotiations are never easy. I've said that over the last 15 years where we've gone through collective bargaining agreements, and this one certainly was no easier. Frankly, it was more difficult. But fortunately, we've been able to reach agreement, and then collectively we'll work to get back to play, deliver for our fans, and deliver for our players the sport they love. And then we will work hard to build back some of the value, if you will, in the relationship that we worked hard to create collectively in December and January of last year.
Eric, he also said that because the league is locked into spending through 2025 on this ratified CBA, that said that the owners are committed and quote, speaks to the desire of the ownership to be courageous.
And I think so many times labor negotiations are framed when they're over as winners and losers. The winners here is this league is going to go forward, and the players are going to be able to have security for 5 years that regardless of the impact on revenue is associated with just a recession, or fans decide that they don't want to go to games, or sponsors decide that they no longer, because of the impact on their businesses, that they're going to spend at those levels. We have locked in our spending through 2025. And that was the first basic tenet of the discussions. and it was the first thing that we got ownership to agree to. I think it speaks to the desire of our ownership to continue to be courageous and to continue to believe in the league. And frankly, I think it represents on our part this belief that this pandemic is going to end at some point, and we're going to get this country back and the economy back.
So the fact that the owners are, and the conditions economically are so uncertain at this point, not only right now, but in the future, next year and the following year. Do you agree with that use of the word courageous?
Yeah, I think when we kind of take a step back and think about the bigger picture of things, I don't think anyone was ever worried about the long-term growth of MLS. I think throughout this entire year, obviously there was going to be some difficult financial decisions to be made. The league is obviously not making as much money as they anticipated, and I think we as players realize that, but I don't think there was ever any concern about whether or not MLS is going to be a viable product for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I think it's a very short-term problem that they're having, and maybe it will flow in next year depending on how we all deal with coronavirus. But again, I don't see a world where heading into the U.S. hosting a World Cup in 2026 that the league is going to suddenly stop spending money. And I think our player pool and probably the ownership as well views that 2026 World Cup as kind of an inflection point for the league to really take a massive step forward. So I would assume they will do everything in their powers to, whether that's financially or whatever, to make sure that as these years flow and as we get closer to 2026, that the league is ready to take advantage of that moment when the entire world is watching soccer in the U.S. And then we have a league after that. It's hopefully one of the best leagues in the world. Eric
Miller, a defender, Nashville SC, Executive Committee member for the MLSPA. Let's talk some soccer. You're going to play, it looks like. I know I want to talk about your training a little bit, but it's on to Orlando. It's going to happen. There aren't specific dates yet, right? As of today, we're recording this on Friday.
We have not seen any specific dates yet. No, there's loose outlines and guidelines, but they haven't obviously scheduled games or anything like that yet.
All right. So it's probably safe to say the month of July, you will all be in Orlando at the, is it Coronado Springs Resort? That I don't think they've announced that either, but that appears to be. I went on to look at some pictures. It's got a huge lobby, which I guess is pretty good since all 26 teams are going to be there.
Social distancing in there, so yeah, that works out well.
Yeah, and a number of pools. I don't know how all that will work, but so the commissioner said that the maximum amount of days that any player or team would be there is 35. That's about 5 weeks. So that's significantly reduced from the original plan, 8 to 10 weeks. So that was also important to the players?
Yeah, that was the biggest sticking point for our player pool. I think there was the original proposals for length of time were just simply way too long. Guys with families, guys with pregnant wives, guys with responsibilities at home. You just can't be away for that long. And I think that was the initial proposals were crazy amounts of time to be stuck in a hotel in Orlando, Florida. So I think thankfully the league listened to that and tried to work with the Players Association to shorten the length of time. Now it's a little bit more palatable. It's a little bit more easy to wrap your mind around going down there for 25 to 35 days or whatever it's going to be. So I think that was a big step forward, and that got a lot of guys who were pretty against going to Orlando to play games kind of into the willing to go camp.
Well, things we've heard are like 3 preliminary round matches, 16 teams advance to a knockout stage. There's a trophy, maybe a CONCACAF Champions League berth. Again, none of this has been announced, but can you confirm any of that?
I don't think I'm allowed to confirm any of that. I'll just say that I think the league really wants to make this a real competition. I think they want to make sure that guys are competing and guys are really doing their utmost to make these national television games competitive. And I think while there are difficulties that in terms of no fans, short preparation times, I think at the end of the day, if you get MLS players and MLS teams into a location with a legitimate prize and with legitimate things on the line, it's hard to imagine that guys won't be competing and doing their utmost to either try to win a trophy try to win a Champions League spot or whatever it is at the end of the tournament. So I think that there initially was some concern whether or not guys would just kind of take it off and pretend they have injuries. But I think now that we get closer to it, I see guys excited to go play, excited to compete, and excited to get back to some sense of normalcy.
I thought the commissioner was a little vague on the on players that could opt out. There was pre-existing conditions, family concerns. Do you have any clear definition as a players group from the league as to where a player would be given permission to stay home?
So it seems like it's going to be a very case-by-case basis. Immunocompromised people, people with wives who are due to give birth while we're gone, I think is obviously two obvious ones. And then from there, you get into a little bit of a gray zone where it's kind of going to kind of have to be navigated with a player in his club in the league, because there's guys that have different responsibilities at home that can't leave. There's going to be staff with the same issues where they can't leave. So I think it's going to kind of all be very case to case. But I think the main two ones are immunocompromised people or players or staff, and then people with wives who are due to give birth either shortly after we arrive or at some point while we're there.
You mentioned the empty stadiums a little earlier. I'm wondering which side you are on of the piped-in sound. You've watched these Bundesliga matches. Some have had it, some haven't. What would your preference be if you're out there on the pitch down in Orlando?
Personally, while watching the games in the Bundesliga, I've really liked it. I think I maybe would have a different answer if I could speak German and I could kind of hear what guys were saying and what was going on. So
same here. Yeah, that's what I thought.
In Germany, it might feel differently, and our fans in the U.S. might be interested to hear what communication there is on the field. But I think, in general, from a TV perspective, I've really enjoyed the crowd noise. I think they've done a really good job with it. And I think it makes it feel a little bit more like a real game, which is what everyone wants it to be. I
like the cardboard cutouts by Gladbach of their supporters, right?
Those are great. Yeah, those are really nice. I think combination of cutouts and the crowd noise, you're almost close to having real people in there.
Have you seen the in the Danish league? They've got one of the teams. They did a Zoom. They went around the stadium with Zoom screens with their supporters. That was wild.
It was very, very futuristic. Probably defensive from the pull off, but it was definitely cool.
Eric, do you have any insight as to what will happen next after this tournament, which we assume will conclude near the end of July, maybe early August? Again, there's this uncertainty around the country, but what are some of the tentative discussions surrounding it? And then where do the players stand on extending the season into January?
Yeah, so there's been tentative discussions about hosting games in the fall. I think the league is hopeful that they can move towards playing in markets without fans. I think the players are hopeful that we can do that as well. We all want to play games. We all want to compete, and we all want to eventually have the opportunity to win MLS Cup. So I think if things go well, I think there will be games in the fall, and there will be opportunities for guys to play a significant amount of games. I think anytime you think about extending out the season, you run into a lot of issues, whether it's when option dates have to be either picked up or denied. There's the international transfer window that's probably not going to move, so then you're starting to work into that. But I think we're a league that plays through a summer transfer window, so there is some precedent to us doing things like that. I think in general, we'd like to be wrapped up by December 31st and then ready to move on to the next season. But I think players are pretty open to solutions. I think our player association is just trying to make the season as good as possible for the fans, because I think everyone in this country has been through a lot. There's a lot of problems at almost every level, and I think we want to be a source of joy and a source of normalcy for people. So I think in the fall, if we can play as many games as possible, I think our player pool is happy to do that.
When I was hearing about January 2021, I was imagining New York City at Minnesota United, January 21st, MLS Cup final. That would be pleasant.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I was on the bench for when New York City came in March, and that was a pretty snowy affair. So I can't even imagine what January would be like.
Well, your connection to Minnesota runs deep. You did play there with Minnesota United, but it goes beyond that. You grew up there, played for Bangor's Tsunami, Minnesota Thunder. parts of those 2 seasons with United. Your wife, Cassie Coleman, and her family, they're pretty much a soccer legendary family in Minnesota. So what has it been like for you and Cassie to watch from afar and see what's going on with all the civil unrest?
Yeah, I think it's been a surreal experience. I think for me personally, I'm a white dude that grew up in the suburbs of St. Paul, so it's not really time for me to give my opinion or time for me to voice what I need to do. It's time for me to listen. And I think I need to listen. I need to donate money to funds and to people that are going to hopefully take this country into a better direction. And I think for us, it's just kind of, and I think for all white people in the United States, it's time to take a little bit of a backseat and just really listen to people that are more informed about this stuff and can hopefully help solve these numerous problems that we have. I think it's crazy to see it happen in Minneapolis, in a place that we don't live too far south of. And I think it's really, really sad, and it makes you really angry. But again, I think it's just time for me to listen and to kind of let people who are smarter than me and know more about this stuff tell me what needs to happen, and in whatever way I can be an ally, in whatever way I can help financially, I need to do that stuff. And that's about all I can do. I need to obviously learn and evaluate myself. But I think most importantly, it's just time for people like me to listen.
Yeah, you mentioned surreal. So you're watching on TV places where you've walked around and shopped. And
yeah, it's definitely, I think surreal is the perfect word. I mean, especially I almost didn't have time to like process everything, because we were in the midst of all this crazy MLSPA, MLS stuff, that this stuff was kind of going on. And it was like, this MLSPA stuff is so unimportant really in the grand scheme of things in terms of race relations in the United States. So I think for me, it's now my time to process and educate myself and to really understand what's going on, and then hopefully just be an ally to all the Black people in the United States and help out in whatever way that I can.
I'm absolutely with you on that, Eric. One final thought, your current training status. So MLS lifted the full team training moratorium in Nashville. What's the situation? What are you allowed to do right now? Can you guys go to full team training, or are you still in the small groups?
So we have a couple hurdles to jump over before we can go to full team training. We have been doing small group training with social distancing, which sounds weird, but it actually is considerably better than being able to train individually. You can actually pass the ball to people. You can kind of start to work as a team. So I think that's been a huge step. You're also just kind of around guys a little bit more while you're still 6 feet apart. At least you're like talking and seeing and kind of getting slowly back to your normal routine. Obviously, MLS said you can full team train now, but there's a lot of testing protocols and different things of that nature that we have to sort out here. But I think the club and especially the players are very hopeful that we can get to that as soon as possible.
So my club team here in New Jersey, we're going to begin training soon. It'll be similar. We're allowed, I would think, 9 or 10 players plus the coach. You're in that half a field with 6. That's the way it's working? So I'm wondering, from a coaching standpoint, can you give some tips as to some of the exercises you're doing, and what can I do with my team when I get them back out there?
You know what? Crossing and finishing is a great thing to do, because you can get a goalie involved. You can kind of get a bunch of different position groups. We've had a lot of just passing patterns and stuff, it seems a little monotonous. And I think it's something that if you would ask me 5 months ago, what do I think about passing patterns? I was I think they're okay. I really like to do them for a short amount of time. But when you haven't done them for 2 to 3 to 4 months or however long it's been, it's really nice now to be able to just pass the ball to someone and they pass it back to you. And it just simulates those game-like conditions a little more than me passing it into a rebounder and it coming back to me. So I think any passing pattern stuff, any technical work that you can do with the group has been kind of the most fun that our guys have had. And then obviously there's a huge fitness component that we've tried to get into as well, so that when we can actually play and train with our full group, that we don't have to worry about that stuff. But don't tell your players I told them to run you. Told you to run you.
All right. I won't share that part of it. Eric, thank you so much for the generous amount of time you spent on this. Some important things going on in the league, and be safe and best of luck in Orlando.
Sounds good. You too. I appreciate it.